Do you hear the click of a lock in a quiet hallway only? It's the one that seals the day away. That small domestic sound becomes a verdict. The air narrows, ordinary life compresses, and a body that once knew sunlight is measured now in footsteps and muffled breathing. You're listening to 102 Hours where stories don't just get told. They come alive in the dark. You step into this story with a flashlight and a tremor, because the worst monsters were familiar faces. Welcome to Amstetten, 1984. Welcome to a door that closes on daylight. You probably won't survive this ULL. Keep checking the locks in your head, but that's the point. These stories make you watch your world more sharply. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to 102 Hours, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments so I know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let 102 Hours guide you into tonight's journey. You move with Elisabeth the instant she is asked to lend a hand with a door small, plausible, ordinary. She is 18. She trusts her father. In the quiet economy of family favors, this is one that takes little thought. That ordinary convenience is the bait. A mainstream historical fact settles here like cold. In many long-term captivity cases, the perpetrator is known to and often trusted by the victim. Knowing that makes the betrayal a sharper cut. The cellar door itself is crafted to look banal, a recessed panel, a neutral paint, a lock that reads like a homeowner's common sense. Josef Fritzl, trained as an electrical engineer, treats the house like a schematic. The dungeon is the result of methodical planning rather than chaotic impulse. A fringe tidbit whispered by locals is that the cellar's construction was papered over with official permits, forms and signatures that gave the work a bureaucratic patina and quietly hid its true purpose. You descend with her. The first sensation below is a change in light. Workman bright bulbs replaced by a cheap yellow glow that makes shadows hug the corners. The air carries the mineral temps of damp stone and the faint, familiar smell of old soap. You notice the small indignities before the big ones, having to ask for a blanket, needing permission to shift a foot, the way a bathroom visit becomes a negotiated event. Survival, in the first hours, is made of tiny bargains and the slow rearrangement of dignity. Time fragments in captivity. Days are not numbered on a calendar, but on rituals. The tray that slides through a hatch, the voice on the other side providing a schedule, the clink of a key that says when hunger ends. In such places, language itself becomes a currency. Names, numbers, promises each can be traded or withheld. That is a known pattern in true crime cases, where control is the weapon. Ordinary routines are repurposed into instruments of domination. Investigators still question whether earlier signs disturbed neighbors. Unreturned calls, subtle changes in appearances could have interrupted that first descent. Hindsight has its sharp teeth, living people do not. For now, you are with Elisabeth, feeling the dust under your palm as you press it into the banister. Listening for the familiar steps that no longer guarantee rescue. The domestic details become anchors and wounds at once. A thin mattress folded into a corner. A small, cracked mirror used furtively to see a pressed face. A photograph tucked under a loose plank and memorized like contraband. Those items are not props for a narrative. They are the scaffolding of endurance. In the hush, you start to catalogue tiny resistances, humming a song to mark a day, pressing a nail into wood to count time, folding a scrap of cloth into a talisman that smells faintly of lavender. Betrayal is surgical. The man bolting the door is also the one who teaches you to tie your shoelaces, who hands you work gloves, who takes groceries to the table above. That duality helper in captivity rearranges every ordinary memory into a potential weapon. You fixate on one domestic image, keys on a mantle, once harmless, now turned into instruments of confinement. It is this mundane twist that makes the story feel like an ache you can't ignore. There are flickers of imagined interference, a neighbor stumbling into the hallway, a cousin asking why she isn't answering, but narratives narrow quickly. What you can do is watch the small changes, how a voice on the other side becomes less instructive and more possessing, how the clatter of dishes above sounds suddenly like an accusation, how a private tally scratched into a joist is both a map and a prayer. The first night is mostly a list of small defenses. You hum under your breath. You fold a cloth into a small token. You mark a stop on a joist with a fingernail to remind yourself that your life moves forward. Those rituals are fragile, but they are the first law of survival when sunlight is a rumor. The detail that lingers is not a dramatic escape, but a domestic click repeated in your ears like a heartbeat. The lock that once promised safety now promises absence. In the dark, you learn to ration silence like food. Every hesitation becomes a strategy. You imagine a future that is not promised, sketching tiny plans how to listen for the pattern of footsteps, how to memorize the scrape of a cupboard hinge, how to save energy for a run that may never be taken. Those mental rehearsals are both brittle and necessary. They are the architecture of refusal when the world around you insists on obedience. So you sit with that click. Let it sink into your bones. It is ordinary and it is monstrous, and it fractures the narrative of trust in a way that will ripple through everything that follows. This beginning is small but decisive. A door, a lock, and the long patient work of endurance that begins the moment that sound echoes. You watch him with the calm attention of someone who reads schematics for fun, notes, measurements, angles penciled in a margin. Josef Fritzl treats the house like an instruction manual, and the basement like a project that requires precise tolerances. He is trained to think in loads and clearances and service access. That training becomes the scaffolding for secrecy. The cellar is not a hasty grave dug in a fever. It's a plan executed over years, with pauses and permits and the slow patience of someone who measures twice and cuts once. From the outside, the work looks domestic. A new foundation wall patched into a garden, a delivery of cement, a man carrying bundles at dawn. You notice the banal details because you are trying to understand how terror wears the face of normalcy. A mainstream historical fact settles here like cold. Other high-profile captors have used similarly hidden spaces. Think of the Ariel Castro case in Cleveland, where secret rooms within a house concealed victims for years. Patterns repeat. Secrecy through domestic camouflage is efficient, slow, and cruel. He files forms. He signs drawings. Papers are stamped at municipal windows and folded into the dull bureaucracy of town life. That is a clever move. When officialdom sees its own paperwork, it rarely looks for malice. A fringe whisper among Amstetten residents later says, "The Cellar's paperwork claimed the space was storage for heating equipment." Innocuous phrase that blunted curiosity. You picture a clerk at a desk, bored and polite, folding a permit and never imagining the human architecture it enables. The cellar itself is layered like an onion. A reinforced steel door gives into a short corridor. Another door, thicker and bolted, stands beyond. Narrow rooms branch off, each sized to minimize wasted space, yet avoid obvious signs on the ground level. No skylights, No vents obvious to the street. Ventilation is subtle and calculated. Air shafts snake through crawl spaces and are muffled by insulation, hidden behind cupboards or tucked into the service voids that run beneath floorboards. Plumbing runs along false channels so that a casual inspection upstairs would only see a tidy hot water system. You trace the logistics and realize the scale. Building materials arrive in small, plausible loads. Heavy machinery is unnecessary because much of the work is manual and secretive. This is a fact of many such constructions. Comfort work often relies on time and repetition, not brute force. Joseph times deliveries, works nights, and uses his technical vocabulary to deflect questions. Neighbors remember bits and odd smell, a late-night truck, a man carrying what looked like insulation. Those fragments knit into a pattern if you look long enough. The design is also psychological. Doors face inwards, corridors narrow to reduce the ability to run, and sleeping areas are windowless to prevent orientation by daylight. Yet it is not total depravity. The space includes small mercies: a hot plate, a sink, a shelf for a few plates. Those choices are as much about control as they are about the captor's own, logistics making the prisoner manageable, predictable. You notice the way light is engineered, bulbs on timers, low-watt fixtures that keep eyes from adjusting to brightness, making both wakefulness and sleep subject to someone else's schedule. You consider the role of expertise. Men schooled in engineering, construction, or trades have a terrifying advantage. They understand how to hide weight, how to mask a vent, how to make a floor bear loads without telling the eyes above. Those skills, when turned inward, convert a family home into a device for imprisonment. A quirky note later surfaced in town gossip. People joked that Joseph could wire the moon if he wanted tooth. Compliments slipped into a rumor once the truth broke, and the joke curdled into something colder. Investigators still question whether permit systems and municipal checks could have been more probing, whether signatures on forms should have triggered inspections that went beyond measurements and into intent. That question sits heavy on the case because it asks whether normal processes, designed to order life, were unintentionally enlisted in violence. You stand in the imagined crawl space and hear the whisper of plaster, the faint settling of a house that has absorbed another life. Building a secret is an exercise in patience. Move slowly enough that attention blinks past. Create paperwork to distract, and place the most incriminating details behind layers of the everyday. The Cellar's genius is banal. It depends on people not wanting to see, on the assumption that houses are used for houses. At night you think about the mundane choices that facilitated imprisonment. A new gutter here, a replaced stove. They're small updates that make a trail of plausible deniability. You begin to catalogue the ways systems can be misread. A municipal stamp means competence, not morality. A delivery slip is a mundane ledger, not a manifesto. Those are the grey zones where silence gathers, where negligence and deception find the softest ground. You also imagine maintenance, a locked toolbox that arrives and leaves, a careful patching of mortar around a new vent, the slow sanding of edges so nothing catches the eye. Those tiny finishing moves are the work of someone who understands that perfection breeds forgetfulness. If neighbors see clean edges, they assume competence, not concealment. And when you think about it, the most chilling detail is how effective normalcy becomes at masking atrocity. The same skills that make a house comfortable also make it an excellent place to hide a life. Finally, you come back to the practical. The walls are thick enough to muffle sound. The door locks are industrial. And Joseph's technical mind has left faint signatures. neat wiring runs, labeled junction boxes, a ventilation duct disguised as a soil pipe. Those marks are fingerprints of method rather than passion. They tell you that the cellar was not chaos. It was an engineered solution to a problem the builder wanted to ensure never escaped. You leave the blueprint in your head like a map of a hidden room. It is an ugly map, drawn with polite lines and official stamps, and it shows how the ordinary can be repurposed into something monstrous. The lesson is simple and cold. Control can be built, and when it is, it looks exactly like careful workmanship. You walk the lanes of Amstetten in a late summer hush, listening to a town that believes itself ordinary. Shops open at predictable hours. Men haggle over cheeses and newspapers. A tram clanks on its route, and the rhythm of daily life smooths out the rough bits. Small towns are machines of familiarity. Faces repeat history's loop, and the appetite for curiosity is often tempered by neighborly politeness. That atmosphere, comforting as it is also porous. It lets some things fall through its seams. You notice how icily a secret can blend into that fabric. A mainstream historical fact. In many prolonged abuse and captivity cases, perpetrators are embedded in their communities, teachers, tradesmen, respected fathers, and that social standing can inhibit scrutiny. People protect what is familiar. They prefer plausible explanations to disruptive ones. So when a house on a quiet street changes in ways that might hint at trouble, the town's first move is often to explain those changes away. From the outside, the Fritzl home reads as typical. Flower boxes, neat curtains, a front stoop scrubbed on Sundays. You pass the bakery where the owner remembers Josef as punctual and polite. He waves, he carries a parcel from a builder's supply. He fiddles with wiring and offers benign advice about a leaky radiator. Those are small acts that stitch a social safety net around a man who, in secret, is doing terrible things. The dual life of the house makes the town a reluctant witness. In hushed gossip you find fringe corners. Later, some townsfolk will recall odd jokes, whispers, that the house hosted a private workshop where Josef tinkered on projects late into the night. An older woman passes on a rumor that a child's cry once escaped the backyard at dusk and was blamed on foxes. Those details are the kind historians sometimes call soft evidence. Not proof, but clues that, in aggregate, suggest a different shape to ordinary life. The line between rumor and reality is thin in a small place where people prefer explanation to alarm. You sense the pressure that keeps people from asking harder questions. There is a social economy to not knowing. Friendships, business relationships, reputations, everything is at risk when you accuse. A neighbor might think, who am I to interfere? A shopkeeper might fear losing a customer. Those calculations are mundane and human, but they are also fertile ground for concealment. Investigators still question whether the town's deference to private matters delayed the unraveling of the truth. Public rituals reinforce the illusion. Church bells ring and sermons remind parishioners to forgive. Festivals bring the streets alive with booths and music, offering a communal alibi for what cannot be seen. In these rhythms, anomalies are often catalogued as quirks. An extra lock, a late-night delivery, a hushed argument. They are filed away under personal problems. Over time, those filings accumulate until they make a quiet archive of missed interventions. You walk past the municipal office, imagining the stacks of permits and the polite clerks who stamp forms without narrative. Systems designed to record and regulate life can become blind if they are treated as administrative chores rather than investigative processes. The Fritzl permits were, according to later reconstructions, generic storage, insulation, routine improvements. That paperwork provided a bureaucratic sheen that invited no second look. There is another seam you notice. Children. In Amstetten, kids ride bikes around the square and chase pigeons. Their laughter a counterpoint to darker possibilities. When a new child appears with no obvious parentage, or when a child is returned early from school, small questions might arise. In this town, anomalies were often explained by sympathy, by a convenient story because the cost of confronting a neighbor's private life felt too high. Social currency can be spent too thinly on suspicion. You also see the machinery of rumor and protection, friendships that circle like guardians, marriages that act as shields, silent nods that signal we're not prying. That protective instinct is not always malicious. Sometimes it's an attempt to preserve communal peace. The challenge is that peace can be a veneer. Peace that covers a cellar is not actually peace at all. At the cafe, a man mentions Joseph's competence, how he could fix a fuse in a heartbeat, and someone else nods, adding that Joseph was private but polite. Those small testimonials become indirect alibis. It's easier to remember the pleasantness than to hold the dissonant thought that a neighbor could be monstrous. The neatness of a life above ground makes suspicion feel like an overreaction. You stroll the streets and pick up the cadence of routines that both protect and blind. A bus schedule, a morning market, a priest's hour for confessions all occupy attention. They are the perfect camouflage for the slow work of concealment, because life's ordinary motions make suspicious patterns seem like exceptions rather than symptoms. Finally, you listen to the way silence operates here. Not the dramatic absence of sound, but a social quiet where probing questions are softened into polite evasions. People use euphemism to navigate discomfort. They reframe, redirect, and sometimes rationalize. That softening is a safety valve for communities, but it's also a tunnel through which secrecy travels. As you leave the square, you carry with you a sense of how a town's mundane courtesies can be complicit without malice. How the daily choreography of normal life can provide the perfect cover for something monstrous. Remember that shadow, you tell yourself, and then you step back into the hum of the town, where life goes on and secrets wait in the dark. You watch him move through the house with a casual competence that almost looks benevolent, fixing a socket, weighing a fuse, offering a hand to a neighbor with a sagging gait. That ease is part of the camouflage. Josef Fritzl's outward persona, reliable, technically skilled, quietly industrious, fits the profile of many long-term perpetrators. Historically, those who hide violence for years are often embedded in roles that earn trust. That fact is not a narrative trick. It is a frequent pattern investigators note when they peel back these kinds of lives. You stand at the threshold of a man who keeps two ledgers, one neat, official, and public, the other the quiet record of a life concealed. The public ledger holds his job, a tidy address, a marriage certificate. The private one is made of routine meals delivered, schedules dictated, the mechanical excellence of someone who can make a room airtight. In small towns, reliability becomes a currency. When a man returns your tools and fixes your fence, you are less likely to interrogate his motives. That currency can be spent very cheaply on privacy. There is a fringe detail that trickles through recollections. Locals later muttered that Joseph kept a small coded notebook for his project's pages, of numbers and times, precise but innocuous. Neighbors carried that gossip like seasoning for conversation, because it was easier to call it eccentricity than to imagine what it might conceal. Quirky anecdotes like this rarely appear in court as hard proof, but they become the texture of hindsight, They are how communities narrate the things they missed. You move through the rituals of his double life. In the morning he irons shirts, walks down to the bakery, offers to help someone lift a heavy box. At night he operates a hidden system where schedules are obeyed and freedoms are purchased with compliance. That duality is the case's most insidious architecture. The same hands that mend a bicycle also slide a food tray through a slot. The cognitive dissonance. This creates as a survival mechanism for the captive. Your captor tucks you in during the daylight hours. Your mind resists naming him as threat. A mainstream truth from criminal psychology. Maintaining a normal social appearance is often a deliberate strategy for offenders. Smiles and civic participation reduce scrutiny. You notice how friendliness functions like armor, softening suspicion and converting curiosity into polite acceptance. It becomes easier to remember the pleasant gestures than to imagine a neighbor capable of calculated cruelty. Investigators still question whether Fritzl's standing in the community delayed action that might have ended his crimes sooner. That question is blunt and persistent. Would more probing neighbors, more skeptical friends, have changed the timeline? The debate underlines how communal trust intended to hold a town together can be weaponized by someone who understands the economy of reputation. The domestic theater of his mask is precise. Family meals above ground were small performances of normalcy. Neighbors received favors that bought conversational goodwill. He was seen at church on Sundays, attentive and discreet. Presence becomes an alibi. If you are always visible, who imagines you are absent in the most terrible sense? That paradox, being omnipresent yet secretly absent, becomes the captor's invisible tool. You catch microskips in the performance. A voice that hardens briefly over a phone call. Hands that hesitate before a hug. Eyes that watch a child with calculation rather than warmth. Psychologists later catalogue such micro-behaviors as tiny fractures in the mask, telling to those who pay attention but often invisible within ordinary interactions. Those small cracks do not explode into revelations. They are clues, like hairline fissures in plaster, that widen under pressure. Remember that faint whisper, the sound that could be widened, translated into how community rumors begin. Tiny contradictions that, if unpursued, calcify into placid acceptance. Your role, listening now, is to track those dissonances. A late delivery that is never explained. A child's clothing appearing and disappearing. Small absences accompanied by plausible stories. In other cases, neighbors who followed such lines of detail were the ones who eventually pushed authorities to act. The emotional economy of a double life is as chilling as any technical detail. The captor performs intimacy, recalling birthdays, offering help at funerals, standing in the crowd with a sorrowful face. Those acts are investments in credibility. You watch how proximity acts instrumentally. You are always there. You suppress suspicion by default. That social currency, when traded correctly, buys a wide margin of belief. There is also the household choreography that preserves the lie. Spouses, children, and relatives create narratives that preserve cohesion. Plausible explanations, scheduled errands, and a shared avoidance of awkward questions. The cost of rocking the boat is social exile, family rupture, and economic instability, very real penalties that push people toward convenient narratives instead of disruptive truth. That preference is human. It is also exploitable. A small, almost absurd detail appears in fringe accounts. Neighbors later joked that Josef timed the house like a clock, scheduling chores and meals so precisely that everyone's routines stayed synchronized and suspicion never gained traction. Whether literal or metaphorical, the anecdote captures the essence. Discipline and order can themselves be tools of concealment. Your attention turns to the practical supports of this double life: paid utilities, a tidy garden, membership in clubs, polish for a public persona. These are not proofs of innocence. They are social armor. Criminologists note bluntly that ordinariness is often weaponized. You are mapping instrumentality, not excusing it. Normal life can be an intentional performance that conceals cruelty. Toward the end of this portrait, you feel a complex, uncomfortable mixture: contempt for the man who inflicted harm, and reluctant sympathy for how a community's decency can be manipulated. People want to believe their neighbors. That trust is civic glue and, sometimes, a vulnerability. The bitter lesson is simple: the ordinary can conceal the extraordinarily cruel, and the machinery of everyday life, favor, reputation, paperwork, can be repurposed into tools of domination. You leave his double life like a stitched seam in clothing, neat and invisible unless you pull at it. The soft domestic details that made him liked also made him unsuspected. That is the bitter geometry of many family-centered crimes. Monsters are often practiced in mundane niceties, and that practice makes them devastatingly hard to catch. You learn winter as a new language. The consonants are cold. The vowels are condensation on a metal bowl. The first season underground is less a single event than a slow curriculum in temperature, hunger, and small mercies. You notice how the air bites at exposed skin and how warmth becomes a currency worth bargaining for with silence and obedience. Everything that felt ordinary sunlight on the back of your hand, the sudden joy of an open window, turns into a memory you have to pronounce carefully, like a forbidden name. A mainstream historical fact sits quietly in the background. In documented long-term captivity cases, victims commonly develop structured daily routines and coping strategies to preserve sanity's sleep schedules, counting systems, songs memorized to mark time. That truth is practical rather than noble. Rituals are how people stop being suspended and start being makers of a life, however constrained. You begin to assemble your days into such rituals because chaos would unmoor you faster than hunger or cold. Night stretches longer in the cellar because artificial light is stingy, and the bulbs are on timers that favor the captor's schedule over human circadian needs. Your body learns to expect this pattern: 3 hours dim, 1 hour bright, another stretch of dim. Sleep comes in segments. Dreams are punctuated and shallow. You notice the small physiological betrayals: fingers that tingle from cold, teeth that ache when a storm presses against the house, the way your breath fogs in the thin glow of a lamp. Those bodily details are not melodrama. They are the ledger of existence down here. Food becomes a set of rituals too. Meals are slid through a hatch like contraband. The clink of the tray is a punctuation mark. You are careful about how you chew, conserving crumbs like a miser saves coin. You invent textures from memory: the flaky crust of bread you once had at a bakery, the wet cold of a peeled apple, the coarse salt crystals that tasted like the sea. Sometimes hunger sharpens perception: colors feel more intense in recollection, noises more distinct. Other times, hunger dulls the world to a grayscale hum where only movement registers. A fringe tidbit surfaces in the way you begin to mark days: a tiny notch carved into a joist for the full moon, a pressed piece of cloth folded against a mattress every 7th day, a whispered name repeated into the plaster until it seems to soften. Later, others will recount that Elisabeth scratched a crude calendar into a beam. aligning birthdays and moon phases like a talisman. Whether that exact beam existed or not, the detail captures something true. People need anchors, and making marks is a primitive, potent way to declare you continued to exist. Cold teaches you ingenuity. You learn to repurpose insulation scraps into blankets, to wedge newspapers into cracks where air whips through, to shuffle a thin mattress against a wall so a body can share less space with the cold. These improvisations are not heroic gestures. They are slow, thoughtful engineering of comfort on a starvation budget. You become an amateur in those arts, stucking, folding, compressing to eke out warmth in degrees. It is practical work that sharpens the mind and blunts despair. There are also social strategies. If children are present, you become a quiet director of small routines that help them sleep. A song hummed low and monotonous. A game of naming constellations that you invent beneath the beams. The steady rhythm of counting footsteps to lull them. When you are alone, you hum to yourself to mark time. These acts are practical and tender in ways that do not require grand gestures. The human voice becomes a tool for continuity. Investigators still question whether early changes in Elisabeth's health and appearance, pale skin, slowed growth, delayed medical checkups, could have prompted earlier interventions if someone had pushed for routine checks. That question hangs because it asks whether ordinary municipal or social obligations might have cut years from the captivity timetable. The first winter also rearranges the meaning of sound. Rain on the roof above is both music and threat. It masks footsteps, but also reminds you that the world continues in ways you cannot access. You learn to listen for micro-patterns, the way a bolt retracts, the cadence of the man's boots passing the stair, the hours when the hatch is opened. Those sonic maps are survival tools. They tell you when to speak, when to move, when to forget the urge to knock. Sanitation is an exercise in shame and strategy. You learn to keep a private dignity with the most basic axe washing beneath a tap, preserving a single clean cloth, hiding bodily functions with ritualized motions. There is embarrassment that never quite leaves you, but it grows smaller with time because survival requires different priorities. Those small private economies of cleanliness are powerful. They are how you keep a sense of self when the world around you tries to reduce you to a problem to be managed. Emotion cycles through you in strange arcs. Some days you are numb, a walking shell of function. Other days a single scent freshly baked bread carried down from above, or the perfume of a passerby can flood you into remembered warmth, until you have to press your palms over your eyes. Guilt and grief fold into practical plans: how to save a scrap for a child, how to hide a seam of a blanket from prying curiosity, how to keep a lullaby intact. You train your emotional responses like a muscle, using them only when they help rather than when they hurt. You begin to notice how seasons above ground shape psychology below. Winter bends expectations inward. People are generally less visible, more forgiving of closed curtains and absent faces. That social winter provides a cruel advantage to someone who wants to hide. The contrast between the world's fading light and the Cellar's enforced night feels like a cosmic unfairness. A personal arithmetic where the world subtracts years from your life without asking. There is a private ledger you maintain in your head. Names of children born, the hours when voices change, the patterns of light. You recite it when you re-alone to prove to yourself that your memories aren't dissolving. Rituals smelling a lavender scrap, touching a carved notch become proof that you existed before the door closed. Those tiny reliquaries are your rebellion. Breathers in the narrative are soft and necessary. You close your eyes and imagine the warmth of a sunbeam. You let that image sit like a benediction for a few seconds. Then practicality reasserts itself. Check the latch, fold the blanket, remind the children of a story. That gentle alternation between memory and maintenance is what keeps you upright. As winter loosens its grip, you feel the slow accumulation of endurance. Calluses on thumbs from carving notches, a song that can be hummed in 3 keys. A way to fold a blanket so 2 small bodies can sleep without touching. Those skills may seem modest, but they are the quietly heroic grammar of survival. They are not about escape. They are about staying whole until an opening appears. You close the section with the sensation of a breath held and released, small, almost silent. The first winter does not end with triumph. It ends with proof. You endured. That endurance is not celebrated loudly. It is catalogued in small marks and quiet songs and the stubborn, ordinary acts that stitch a life back together day by day. You wake to a small, startling sound that feels both ancient and alarmingly present. A cry muffled against concrete. It is a sound that fractures the cellar's dull, mechanical rhythms, proof that life insists on arriving even where it should not. And you learn quickly that a birth in a basement is an event measured in improvisation, tenderness, and a grinding economy of supplies. Babies come into the world with little fanfare down here. There is no plywood-walled delivery room, no team of nurses with practiced hands, only a hot plate for boiling water, a thin mattress folded against a wall, and the steady, stubborn breath of the mother who becomes midwife and guardian in one. You are there when a small hand curls, when a mouth finds warmth. The physical facts are unromantic and precise because life insists on being practical. Towels, wrapped clothing, the slow calming of a new body in a cold room. A mainstream fact settles under your skin. Children born into captivity often face developmental challenges tied to isolation, limited sunlight, constrained physical space, and scant access to routine medical care can shape bodies and minds in ways that echo for years. The cellar becomes a crude nursery and a classroom. And Elisabeth, whose name you already whisper in the dark, learns to divide herself into 2 roles at once. She is mother, surgeon of simple wounds, storyteller, and the inventor of small games that teach a child to count the hours with fingers. Her lullabies are low and practical, songs to steady breathing, games to teach a child to identify the corner of a mattress as home. You begin to catalogue the small miracles, a wool scrap sewn into a blanket, the careful boiling of water for a bottle, a line scratched into wood to mark a baby's first tooth. Those acts are tenderness dressed in necessity. The cruelty of separation is not always violent. Often it is bureaucratic and performative. Fritzl, in A Ledger of Deception, chooses to present some children to the world above as foundlings or abandoned infants, raising them in the family circle and telling stories that patch over inconvenient facts. 3 children later, named Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remain with Elisabeth in the cellar, shorn of sunlight and free contact with the broader world. The others, Lisa, Monica, Alexander, folded into daily life above ground, each cradled by a narrative that hides their true parentage. That arrangement makes a private geography of kinship, siblings separated by a single floor but divided into different moral universes. You notice how identity becomes fractured in this architecture. A child raised above believes in the benign fiction they are told. A child below learns names as rituals and maps the world by sound, stairs creaking, the distant hum of a refrigerator, the cadence of someone walking past the kitchen. Children below have no playground, no schoolyard, no peers whose hands are rough with 100 ordinary scuffs and stories. Their cues for social life are limited and learned in imitation. A smile taught, a question practiced. A mainstream observation from developmental studies is blunt. Social isolation in formative years reshapes language acquisition, play patterns, and trust development in ways that aren't erased quickly. There are small, almost absurd talismans of normalcy down there. A battered children's book appears its edges, softened by many readings, a toy fashioned from string and cloth. A scribbled drawing pinned under a nail. You smell boiled milk and boiled clothes. You know the particular sting of laundry washed in a basin and spread on a narrow rail. Those domesticities are not theatrical. They are the scaffolding of an ordinary childhood imposed onto extraordinary circumstances. You find yourself tenderly cataloguing these details because tenderness is a quiet resistance. A quirky tidbit that later circulates in town gossip captures the surreal choreography of the deception. Some neighbors recall Fritzl producing an infant wrapped in a blanket and delivering it like a solemn parcel to a relative, explaining its presence with a rehearsed line about an abandoned child. Whether the memory is precise or embellished by hindsight, ISN. The point the anecdote shows the lengths to which performance was used to normalize the abnormal. The presentation of children as foundlings is itself an act of narrative engineering. And it works because people are predisposed to accept simple explanations rather than probe uncomfortable impossibilities. You can almost hear the practical negotiations that made this divide possible. A child that appears briefly at a family meal may be excused as a neighbor's orphan. The question of a mother's absence is covered with a plausible story or rooted through the civility of communal concern. Those small social moves turn into an elaborate charade. School registrations arranged, medical visits signed with a convenient line, birthdays celebrated beneath the same roof where a hidden life continues to coil. Investigators still question whether routine checks, health records, school enrollments, inconsistent medical histories might have pierced this performance earlier. That question is blunt and torturous because it asks if the scaffolding of normal life could have been used as an instrument of exposure, rather than a veil. The idea sits in the background like an unanswered bell. Inside the cellar, kinship becomes a taught language. Elisabeth must explain to her children what a mother is sometimes in the abstract, or teach them the names of body parts and the meaning of seasons they have never felt. You watch her invent rituals, a celebration scratched into wood for the moment a child stands, lessons in naming shapes so they can learn geometry without a classroom, a story for each birthday that accrues detail with each retelling. Those are the small, generative acts that turn confinement into a life worth defending. The teen years, when they come, complicate everything. Bodies change, questions proliferate, and a child's need for peers becomes harder to meet underground. You hear about furtive practices, whispered calculus lessons, stilled arguments, the ache of being the only one to know a joke. If one sibling is taken above ground and another left below, the cognitive dissonance can be shattering. Phone calls and meetings don't exist. Letters are a fantasy. The emotional map of family is redrawn without consultation. And yet, amid this engineered cruelty, you find tenderness that feels almost defiant. Elisabeth fashions a play with shadows on the wall to teach her children about the outside. She moves a thin mirror to let a child glimpse their own face. She smuggles stories of fields and sky into the small hours. Those are not grand rescues. They are preservations of a human interior. They are, in their smallness, the thing that keeps children anchored to themselves. When the rest of their identities are being rewritten, you step back from that image. 3 small faces pressed to the bars of a metaphorical cage, 3 others waved at from a different floor. You hold that contrast in your mouth like a bitter herb and swallow. That quiet, cruel arithmetic who is shown and who is hidden, who learns sunlight and who is taught by shadow, becomes one of the cellar's most unbearable truths. Remember that faint whisper, and now listen to a child humming a made-up song to count the day. It sounds ordinary, but it is a declaration. We were here. We survived. You hold a baby for the first time and discover how quickly myths are made. Wrapped in a blanket, delivered to the parlor like a parcel, a child becomes a story before it becomes a person. Josef Fritzl understood this economy of narrative. Present an infant with a tidy explanation, and most people will accept the story because it is easier than the alternative. He hands the world a plausible line, and the world, grateful for simplicity, nods and moves on. You're looking at the mechanics of the lie. In public, Fritzl offers rehearsed narratives on anonymous mother, a foundling on the road, a relative in distress. Those lines are short and serviceable. They require no follow-up, and they are accompanied by gestures of sorrow and assistance that make further curiosity seem intrusive. A mainstream fact anchors this. Several of the children born in the cellar were presented to the outside world as abandoned infants and were raised publicly by family members. The performance is precise. You watch how Fritzl times appearances, a soft knock at a relative's door, a wrapped infant passed into arms, a solemn explanation muttered in the kitchen. Those small theatrical moves are the scaffolding of a convincing deception. The trick is domestic and therefore believable. There are logistical accompaniments to the story. Birth records are adjusted, hospital stories smoothed, and neighbors who might ask are placated with discreet confidences. You imagine a ledger where social explanations are noted like receipts: who heard what, who saw which blanket, which aunt took a child for a day. This is narrative bookkeeping practiced by someone who understands how social optics can be engineered. A fringe tidbit surfaces in the way rumors later folded into gossip. Some in town would later claim that Fritzl had shown an infant to a church group and offered a tearful, implausible explanation about abandonment in a neighboring town. Whether that exact scene happened or not, the anecdote shows how performance normalized the abnormal. You are with the family as these lies accrete. Upstairs, a child is introduced to neighbors as the little niece or a baby found in the doorway, and regular life reasserts itself. Dinner parties, birthdays, and school mornings. Those public rituals become camouflage. The child is dressed, registered at school with a tidy story, and absorbed into a family photo where no one asks where the photograph's context begins and where it ends. Ordinariness is the lie's ally. There is moral arithmetic to this. People assume the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, an insight the manipulator counts on. If someone offers a story with shame and contrition, you tend to forgive. If a person performs vulnerability, you are less likely to suspect deception. Fritzl exploited that bias with small acts of apparent contrition that made deeper inquiries feel voyeuristic or cruel. You also witness the quiet complicity of others, those who, for reasons of kindness or weakness, accept the story and help sustain it. Family members receive infants into their care with sympathetic faces and rarely ask for proof. The social cost of interrogation is too high. Accuse and you risk relationships and reputation. These are blunt, human calculations, not legal strategies, but they form the lattice that keeps a lie in place. Investigators still question whether routine bureaucratic safeguard school registrations, pediatric checkups, and hospital records could have been used as pressure points earlier. That question cuts to systems. Did harmless paperwork become a tool of concealment because no one thought to cross-check? You notice the emotional labor required to keep the myth cohesive. Those who take on an infant must maintain a consistent backstory in public, and the introducer balances empathy with control. Fritzl could switch measures of tenderness with the steel of command, offering a lament that invited only a tissue and a nod, ensuring questions dissolved into polite discomfort. There are delicate dissonances, mismatched eye color between child and claimed parent, a pediatrician who notes an unexplained medical history, or the odd absence of a maternal narrative when someone asks. Those dissonances exist like hairline cracks in plaster. If pursued, they might widen into revelation. But small towns smooth such inconsistencies because smoothing is easier than confrontation. Your attention turns to the children, who internalize the myths with the earnestness of childhood. Above ground, a daughter grows up loving the family that raised her, unaware of the story that created that family image. Below ground, other children develop partial histories sculpted by absence, the psychological consequences of being presented. As found, rather than born to, our profound identity is seeded on a fiction that may later be violently uprooted. There is also an odd economy of shame. Presenting a child as abandoned often absolves the presenting family of moral blame while shifting pity onto them for taking in the orphaned child. Fritzl weaponized this narrative if he could make himself look like a rescuer. He reduced the chance anyone would look for the source. Pause, breathe. A small, necessary silence in which the weight of a particular lie can settle without being shoved aside. You feel the arithmetic of story-making as an act of control. Choose a simple lie, perform it convincingly, and let social systems do the rest. The deception is tended with small, acts-consistent phrases, discreet gestures, and the occasional earnest tear. It is not grand theater. It is devastatingly efficient. You also see how institutions collaborate, sometimes unwittingly. A school accepts a registration form. A doctor files a brief note. A priest offers a blessing. Each small institutional step adds legitimacy. Records accumulate and future questions feel bureaucratic and distant. By the time doubt surfaces, paperwork has mass and inertia. It resists correction because people treat records as final. Later, when the truth breaks, photographs and documents that once comforted neighbors become evidence of deception. Those same images, the birthday cake, the family portraiture reread like palimpsests, revealing where performance replaced truth. It is a grotesque reminder that ordinary rituals can be weaponized into a convincing script for concealment. In the end, you stand with a photograph of a child in your hand whose provenance has been managed like a small estate. A smooth narrative can be as persuasive as physical force, and in this case, narrative functioned as the primary tool of concealment. That is the chilling lesson. Even when you can't see the lock, you can be led to accept the lie he places in your hands. You stand at the edge of a tidy hedge and watch a street where people prefer explanations that preserve neighborliness. The point here is not malice. It is the daily, slow economics of not knowing. In Amstetten, as in many places, people trade civility for comfort, softly choosing a plausible story over a disruptive question. Mainstream fact: perpetrators often hide in plain sight as trusted locals. You walk past a house and notice small signals that an outsider might file as suspicious. A late-night delivery that is never explained. a child who is never wheeled to school, curtains that remain closed year-round. Yet those signals are often reinterpreted into harmless narratives: work, schedules, privacy preferences, quiet grief. People substitute convenience for curiosity because asking is costly. It could mean friction, gossip, loss of trust. It could be awkward. Those social costs are powerful disincentives to inquiry. Officials are folded into this pattern. Bureaucracies are not actively malicious. They are rule-bound and overloaded. Paperwork piles up, and unless someone pushes, forms get rubber-stamped. A fringe detail that later circulates as gossip. Some neighbors later remembered a municipal inspector who joked about the house with too many permits and then shrugged. The memory became shorthand for a missed chance. Whether that exact banter happened or not, the story shows how lightheartedness can turn into a malignant passivity when no one follows through. Relatives contribute their own logic. Family loyalty is intense, and when accusations would break a family open, people often choose to smooth over oddities rather than pry. You watch the calculus. It is cheaper to accept a neighbor's sorrow than to demand proof. It is easier to hand over sympathy than to risk ostracism. That calculus is what keeps many uncomfortable truths unspoken. When a man like Joseph performs contrition, his family can be swayed into silence by shame, fear, or simple disbelief. Those are human reactions, not excuses. You begin to notice patterns of rationalization. A child brought to a relative's home is explained as an orphan from the next town. A late-night noise is chalked up to a workshop project. A delivery of cement is a renovation. Over time, these rationalizations accumulate like dust and make the extraordinary seem ordinary. The social mechanisms that smooth over discomfort do so with an efficiency that is almost bureaucratic. Pattern recognition without investigation. Investigators still question whether informal networks, friends, teachers, local shopkeepers could have been better mobilized to spot inconsistencies in records, attend to missing school absences, or demand explanations for recurring anomalies. That question is painful because it asks whether everyday human choices inadvertently extended a crime. There are cognitive biases at play, too. Confirmation bias makes people preserve the coherency of their world. If someone is helpful and polite, we twist anomalies to fit that narrative. The bystander effect makes it feel like someone else will handle it. Add to that social stigma: who wants to be branded a snoop? And you have a dense fog that muffles inquiry. In small towns, the reputational cost of being the accuser is high. People protect each other accordingly. You notice specific instances where silence functions like material. A neighbor remembers a suppressed scream at dusk, but tells herself it came from the street, not from a house. A teacher files an attendance slip that later looks odd. A doctor notes a child's pale skin, but attributes it to anemia without cross-checking family history. Those isolated judgments, when aggregated, form a chain of missed interventions. Each link alone is forgivable. Together, they constitute negligence of a social sort. There's also a structural issue. Institutions often expect families to Schools assume parental involvement. Health services expect candid histories. When a family lies or hides, those systems are defeated. That design flaw is not a villain in its own right. It is a vulnerability exploited by someone who knows how to speak the language of forms and who understands how to make a plausible narrative appear in the right box on the right sheet. You watch how secrecy is preserved through routine. A neighbor might notice a child at a family table and accept the explanation because the alternative would force them into an awkward confrontation. A parish priest may give a blessing without asking questions, because pastoral care prioritizes consolation. People fill in the gaps with empathy rather than interrogation. Empathy, in this context, is co-opted into concealment. A fringe memory later told in hushed voices involves a woman who once complained of a smell in summer and was told by friends that composting could be foul that way. The anecdote is small and possibly unreliable, but it illustrates how plausible explanations are hoarded as communal currency. If every whiff is rationalized, the pattern never coheres into suspicion. You also consider fear. In some cases, relatives fear retaliation, emotional, legal, or social, and so they stay silent. The perpetrator's role as a provider or community member complicates that fear. Accuse and risk isolation. Stay quiet and preserve social ties. Those are brutal but human calculations. Then there is the role of gender norms and stigma. Women reporting abuse may be doubted or blamed. Their voices can be minimized. That dynamic can be particularly acute in conservative or tight-knit communities, where reputation is a currency and deviation brings real cost. You feel the multiple pressures that keep denunciations from being voiced. A softer, almost tender moment appears when you see that not all silence is collusion. Sometimes it's fatigue. People are simply overwhelmed by daily life, and watching everyone else's troubles does not leave space for systemic scrutiny. The town's mental bandwidth is finite. When everyone is busy surviving, vigilance drops. Finally, you come to a somber arithmetic, the aggregate of small silences, plausible explanations, bureaucratic indifference, and social cost is often as effective at hiding wrongdoing as any locked door. It is an outcome of human systems that prioritize civility and efficiency. The lesson is not only about blame, it's about how communities can be structured to both care and inadvertently enable. You walk away thinking about the ordinary acts that become extraordinary when left unexamined. A late-night delivery, a missing child at school, a neighbor's closed curtains. Each is a tiny test of civic attention. Remember that faint whisper. Now listen for the ways silence adds up. The town is not a conspirator so much as a series of small choices that pile into a weight too heavy to move. You sit with the image still hanging in your mind. Neighbors going about their lives. The Fritzl house standing quiet, while only meters below, children breathe air that never touches sunlight. The silence of Amstetten feels heavier than concrete itself. And here you pause, because this is where we'll leave the story for now. You followed Joseph's deception from blueprints to basement, from Elisabeth's first footsteps underground to the birth of children who know no sky. But the question presses on you. How long can a secret like this survive? How many lies does it take before even the thickest walls begin to crack? In our next episode, you'll step into a darker turn where tragedy strikes, where the stories Joseph spins grow harder to believe, and where suspicion begins to claw at the quiet surface of Amstetten. So if you're still awake, take a moment to breathe, close your eyes if you dare, and prepare for part 2. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the cellar can no longer stay hidden.